Morgan Rivers didn't like being watched, but he liked being unprepared even less. After 2 years of leasing their property while working on a consultancy contract overseas, he and his wife, Jada, had finally returned to the house they had purchased 7 years ago just outside of Savannah. The neighborhood had changed. Not in terms of layout or development, but in atmosphere. It was no longer the easy, invisible hum of well-kept hedges and casual hellos. Now it felt observed. There was a strange tautness in the air, an odd sense that the privacy he and Jada had so carefully preserved was now not just diminished, but deliberately probed. The woman across the street, Karen Wheeler, was the first to break the illusion of normalcy. When they pulled into their driveway, sun-glazed and road-weary, she was already standing outside on her porch, arms crossed and lips pursed, like a teacher waiting for a student to explain why they were late. She didn't wave. She nodded once. A controlled nod, the kind people give when they think they're allowing you into their world, not recognizing yours. Over the next week, things unfolded slowly but deliberately. Karen reintroduced herself, though Morgan had never met her before the move, by dropping off a packet of what she called neighborhood standards, which, as it turned out, she had printed and bound herself, featuring pages of do's and don'ts regarding lawn height, fence colors, acceptable lighting temperatures, and her personal favorite, external monitoring devices. Morgan skimmed it, raised an eyebrow at Jada, and tossed it on the kitchen counter. They were already 5 steps ahead of whatever informal bureaucracy this woman believed she was running. Their home security system was modern, discreet, legal, and fully compliant with state and federal privacy laws. Morgan had upgraded the cameras from their previous analog units to a hybrid cloud-based system before they even left the country. The devices covered the perimeter of the house, entry points, and the garage, with nothing pointing toward public property. It was unobtrusive, but effective. The first sign of intrusion came on a Wednesday. It rained the night before, and Morgan went out early to check the condition of the gutter cameras, which were known to shift under high wind. 2 of them were pitch black. Assuming the lenses had fogged over, he climbed the ladder, wiped the casing, and paused. The surface was sticky. Not dirty, not fogged, painted. A thin coat of matte gray covered the lens. Smooth, even. No dripping or streaking. This wasn't an accident or a prank. Someone had painted his cameras. He checked the rear side yard unit. The same. He didn't speak right away. He went inside, told Jada, and together they checked the footage. Predictably, the affected cameras had lost visual hours earlier, with no indication of who had tampered with them. But Morgan's system wasn't entirely above ground. There was a single backup unit, a tiny cam embedded in a decorative exterior lamp mounted on the back fence, usually reserved for package drops and occasional animal sightings. Morgan pulled the feed. There she was, Karen, in the middle of the night, standing calmly on their property, holding a cloth and a spray can. Her posture was casual, deliberate. No rush. She glanced around once, but never toward the camera. She stepped up, reached toward the lens, sprayed, wiped, and moved to the next. Gloves, headlamp, tote bag. She was organized. That was what unsettled him more than the act itself. She wasn't acting out. She was executing a plan. Morgan took the footage, exported it, and filed an official report online, marking the incident as vandalism and trespassing. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He believed in method over emotion. Jada agreed. They wouldn't escalate. Not yet. But they wouldn't stay passive either. Over the following days, they quietly enhanced their system, not by adding more cameras, but by reconfiguring their network for real-time mirroring to a secured cloud storage system. This time, one also accessible to a licensed third-party security firm downtown. They added biometric access on the primary monitor console and disguised 3 of the external units beneath architectural elements: a birdhouse, a floodlight, and a ground-level lighting fixture near the east gate. They didn't discuss it with the neighbors. They didn't need to, but they did start watching. Karen, in the meantime, doubled down on visibility. She installed a new mailbox with her name embossed in gold, placed potted shrubs along her front path, and positioned a bench just off the sidewalk, from which she appeared to observe the street each morning and evening. Morgan and Jada noticed that any time they left their house, Karen's door would open, sometimes just a crack, sometimes all the way. She never waved, just watched. One morning, a local code enforcement officer stopped by. Polite but vaguely uncomfortable, he said a report had been filed alleging non-compliant lighting, possibly excessive brightness, and unpermitted mounted surveillance. Jada brought out every permit and installation record, including the compliance certificate from 2 years prior. The officer, after checking the documents and glancing at the equipment, confirmed everything was in order. He apologized somewhat stiffly and left. Morgan didn't say much, but that night he walked the perimeter of the property again, just to feel its edges, just to know no one had moved past the lines he trusted. Inside, Jada was organizing the folders, paper and digital, tagging footage and time-stamping interactions. Not for revenge, for protection. They had returned home expecting to find their lives waiting. Instead, they had found Karen. They had come back to reclaim privacy, and instead they found a person who believed that anything not submitted to her control was somehow a threat. Karen didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't vandalize for the thrill. She disrupted order with discipline. That's what made her dangerous. She saw their security system not as a passive barrier but as a declaration of independence. And, to her, independence was an offense. Morgan didn't sleep that night. Not because he was afraid, but because he was calibrating, adjusting alerts, testing motion sensitivity, reviewing logs. Jada brewed coffee at 2 a.m. and sat beside him, silent. Neither spoke, but both knew that something had changed, and not just in their neighborhood. They were being targeted, not by a criminal, but by a neighbor who thought she was entitled to dictate their perimeter, their technology, their right to observe their own property. And somewhere under that calm, strange quiet, Morgan could feel it. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The days that followed were not marked by escalation in any overt sense, but rather by a series of small, calculated disturbances that were difficult to pin down, yet impossible to ignore. The first came in the form of a misplaced delivery, an expensive irrigation controller ordered by Morgan, rerouted to the porch of a neighbor who claimed it had been sitting there for 3 days before anyone noticed. The second came when Jada returned home one afternoon to find the side gate open, though they had kept it locked consistently since their return. There was no damage to the latch, no evidence of tampering, only the strange sensation that someone had walked through and deliberately left it ajar. Morgan reviewed the footage, but the camera facing that portion of the yard, previously unaffected, had gone offline 3 hours before the incident. He checked the hardware himself. The cable had been loosened at the base, not ripped or cut, just slightly detached from the input port as though someone with enough precision and time had disengaged it without leaving visible signs. He replaced the connection, added additional security clamps, and didn't speak a word. Jada, however, began documenting everything in a private timeline she kept on her laptop: dates, hours, locations, corresponding footage reports, weather conditions, and any unusual neighborhood activity. It wasn't paranoia. It was preemptive defense. It was around that time that the garbage cans began shifting. They had always kept their bins in the alcove beside the garage, out of sight and away from wind or traffic. Twice in 1 week, they returned home to find them repositioned, sometimes facing backward, other times partially blocking the driveway. Jada assumed it might be kids until she noticed that the bins were not just moved, but realigned in a way that left the side motion sensor repeatedly tripping. Every 15 minutes the system flagged a minor disturbance and sent a silent alert to her phone. The logs were piling up. It was subtle. It was maddening. Morgan once again adjusted the angles, reprogrammed the notification thresholds, and buried a small vibration sensor in the soil near the corner where the gate met the fence. He had no illusions about stopping Karen outright. She wasn't breaking and entering. She was needling. Quietly, smartly, legally adjacent. And then came the paint. Not just on the cameras. This time, it was on the wall. One morning, Morgan stepped out to retrieve a package and noticed a long, diagonal stroke across the side of the garage. It was faint, barely visible in daylight, as if someone had tested the viscosity of a can of paint before committing to full coverage. A half-inch smear of gray ran along the aluminum siding. Not fresh, not dripping, just there, dried, deliberate, and low enough to go unnoticed unless one was looking. It wasn't vandalism in the traditional sense. It was a calling card. Morgan didn't wipe it away. He documented it, photographed it with scale markers, and placed a small ruler against it for reference. Later that day, he contacted the city inspector's office, not to file a complaint, but to verify camera compliance laws and seek updated regulations on surveillance equipment visibility from public walkways. The woman on the phone was courteous, helpful, and unintentionally revealing. She mentioned, almost in passing, that there had been an anonymous inquiry regarding the legality of concealed home cameras in residential zones, specifically those angled within 10 degrees of adjacent property lines. That inquiry had been logged just days before. Morgan didn't ask for a name. He didn't have to. That evening they received their first official letter, not from law enforcement, not from the city, but from a private community liaison office. Oh, it was carefully worded, filled with bureaucratic softness, citing that several members of the neighborhood have expressed discomfort regarding perceived monitoring activity. It was not a cease and desist. It was a suggestion to consider more community-conscious placement of surveillance technology. No signatures, no phone number, just a generic email and a mailbox P.O. Jada read the letter twice, then placed it in a folder labeled Pressure Points. That night, they reviewed all their equipment settings again. Every angle, every frame rate, every audio threshold. Then they went silent. For the next 48 hours, they did nothing. No letters, no confrontations, no changes. And that was the moment Karen returned. The cam embedded in the side post near the garden beds had been realigned just that morning by Morgan, following a brief check on its night-range clarity. It had a wide-angle lens, discreet but powerful, and this time he made sure the storage was mirrored to a third-party encrypted vault through a municipal trial access port he'd been quietly authorized to use through a former colleague in city IT. Karen didn't know it was on. At 2:13 a.m., she appeared on the far side of their yard wearing a dark hoodie, hair tucked up, flashlight clipped to her collar. She was holding a long pole with a foam-wrapped tip. She approached the northeast corner camera, the one recessed under the eave, and began pressing the pole against it. Softly at first, then firmly. It took her 3 precise movements to turn the camera 90 degrees off axis. She paused, scanned the area, then moved toward the back fence. She stood there, seemingly idle, but the footage showed her pulling a small tool, possibly a hex key from her sleeve, and using it to open the lamp housing. That lamp was no ordinary fixture. It housed the last remaining legacy unit, one not updated since their return, still operating on the older firmware and currently not linked to cloud mirroring. Karen knew. She knew which units were silent and which were loud. She had studied their system. When she finished, she resecured the lamp, adjusted the cap slightly to avoid suspicion, and stepped back into the darkness. The next morning, Morgan received a message. not from his system, from the city liaison assigned to the trial surveillance routing. Unusual activity logged at EO213. Visual confirmation available. Attached was a screenshot. Karen, arm raised, wrist bent, working on the lamp casing. Clear as daylight. Not grainy, not ambiguous. Confirmed. Within minutes, the feed was copied and archived on the city secure channel. Morgan was instructed not to act, not to interfere. A formal flag had been placed on the liaison's dashboard, and the footage had been referred to local enforcement partners for assessment. This wasn't about a private dispute anymore. This was an active review of trespassing, property interference, and targeted tampering. Morgan didn't feel relief. He felt precision. The pressure had crossed a line, and the system, by design, had responded. When he told Jada, she said nothing for a long while. Then, finally, she closed her laptop, pushed her notes aside, and said, "Good. Let it play out." For the first time in weeks, she didn't add anything to her timeline. Oh, she didn't need to. The escalation was no longer theoretical. It was procedural. And Karen, for all her carefully calculated moves, had just stepped into a trap she didn't know existed, because she assumed the cameras she painted were the only ones watching. Karen didn't stop, not after the footage was captured, not after the liaison's office flagged the incident, and certainly not after Morgan and Jada retreated into procedural silence. In fact, her behavior evolved with a new kind of precision, less physical intrusion, more psychological pressure. She didn't return to the cameras, not immediately. Instead, she shifted her attention outward, redirecting the tension from private interference to public manipulation. The first signal came on a Monday morning when Morgan opened his email to find a formal city complaint filed against his address for excessive illumination impacting residential harmony. The language was sanitized but unmistakable, citing a pattern of nighttime glare causing visual disturbance to adjacent homes. The complaint had been signed off through a digital citizen portal, anonymized by default, but the timestamp matched almost exactly with the moment Karen had walked past their driveway the night before, pausing just long enough to glance at the motion-triggered floodlights before continuing her walk. Jada, reviewing the footage later, noted that Karen had lifted a phone just as the light activated, possibly recording the duration and direction. It was petty, but it wasn't stupid. With the complaint now officially logged, the city was required to follow up. Within 48 hours, an environmental officer was scheduled to measure the output levels and verify compliance. Morgan, anticipating this, had already installed dimmers on the exterior units, bringing them well under the threshold. He greeted the inspector calmly, walked him through the system, and presented the model specifications without defensiveness. The inspector, slightly bemused, completed his report without further comment. That same afternoon, the mailbox shifted. It was not vandalized, not damaged, but the angle of the post, cemented for years, was now 3 degrees off-center, just enough to catch the eye. At first, Morgan thought it was wind damage until he noticed the faint scuff mark on the ground beside it. A narrow drag line, like a tool had been wedged underneath and used to lever the base. When he mentioned it to Jada, she simply nodded and wrote the time down. By midweek, Karen changed tactics again. This time, she took the stage publicly. A flyer appeared in several neighborhood mailboxes, including theirs, titled "Creating Safer Streets, a Community Conversation." It invited residents to an informal evening gathering hosted at Karen's home, with light refreshments and open discussion. No official seal, no city sponsorship. Just a soft white border, clip art graphics of homes and trees, and a small italicized subheader, addressing invasive monitoring and discomfort in our shared environment. Jada stared at it for a long time before folding it in half and placing it on the table. "She's building consensus," she said quietly. "Or the illusion of it." Morgan didn't respond. He was reviewing the logs again, not for interference but for pattern recognition. Something in Karen's behavior suggested that she wasn't improvising. She was pacing herself, like she knew exactly how far to push, how often, how visibly, without stepping into legal consequence. She wasn't trying to stay hidden. She was trying to stay just inside the margin of community tolerance, creating friction without fire. That Friday evening, their doorbell rang. On the step stood a man in a blue windbreaker holding a clipboard, introducing himself as a field representative from a private neighborhood service group, partnered with multiple districts across the county. He smiled, explained that they were doing a courtesy pass through the area to gauge interest in voluntary visual standard alignment, language that made Jada's skin crawl. When Morgan asked who had referred them, the man hesitated before saying only that they responded to community trend requests. Jada didn't let him pass the threshold. Morgan took his card and noted the name, then waited until the man had visited 3 more homes before calling the number. It went to voicemail. The message used the same language: visual alignment, street-facing harmony, shared frontage aesthetics. None of it illegal, all of it curated to sound like consensus rather than pressure. The next morning, the small rose trellis in front of the Riverses' home had been uprooted and left lying sideways, as though someone had leaned against it hard enough to break the supports. Nothing else was disturbed. The soil wasn't compressed. No trash, no spray paint. Just the torn trellis and a single garden tie looped around the base, still intact. Morgan took a photo and uploaded it to the secured archive. That evening, he spoke to their immediate neighbors on either side, not to accuse, not to pry, but to gauge tone. The couple to their right was friendly but hesitant, expressing general confusion about the tension lately, and noting that Karen had mentioned surveillance issues during a walk. The neighbor to their left, an older man named Saul, was less diplomatic. "She's making people nervous," he said bluntly. "She acts like she runs the place, and she's got a way of making you feel like saying no is a bad idea." He didn't elaborate, but the point was made. Morgan thanked him and returned home. That night, the camera under the east gutter, one of the newly reinforced units, detected movement again. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was someone in an oversized hoodie, face obscured, walking along the hedge line with a measuring wheel. They stopped twice, marked points with sidewalk chalk, and then disappeared around the block. The footage was crisp, time-stamped, and auto-archived. Morgan didn't wait. He sent the clip directly to the liaison office and received a brief confirmation that it had been logged and escalated for review under the expanded observation protocol. He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. The following day, a small envelope appeared in their mailbox with no return address. Inside was a folded note, handwritten in tight, slanted script. "You're making it worse. You're not safer. You're louder. No name, no signature, no fingerprints." Jada looked at it for a long time before placing it in a plastic sleeve and adding it to her documentation folder. That evening, Karen hosted her meeting. Cars lined her driveway. String lights flickered in her backyard. There were folding chairs, laminated handouts, and a table with lemonade and cookies. Morgan didn't attend. He didn't need to. One of the cameras, positioned discreetly from an upstairs window, caught brief footage of the crowd. About a dozen people. Casual, comfortable, listening. Karen stood at the front, pointing toward a diagram of a generic home layout with red lines marked visibility zones. Jada watched the footage on mute, her mouth a thin line. "She's framing it as safety," she said. "But she's not talking about crime. She's talking about control." Morgan agreed silently. The first escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was methodical. Karen had shifted the conflict from their home to the neighborhood at large, creating a cloud of ambiguity around what was happening and who was responsible. The system was watching. The authorities were tracking. But the court of perception, among the neighbors, among the passive observers, was being quietly swayed. And as Morgan and Jada sat on their porch that night, lights dimmed, cameras active, the breeze carrying the distant sound of laughter from Karen's gathering, they understood something they hadn't before. This wasn't about privacy. It wasn't even about them. It was about one woman's belief that proximity gave her jurisdiction, that watching meant owning. And the real escalation wasn't in what she did. It was in how many people she convinced to let her do it. By the time the city liaisons department initiated direct contact with Morgan, a perceptible shift had already occurred. Not in Karen's behavior, which remained unnervingly consistent, but in how the system surrounding the neighborhood began to quietly respond. It started with a formal request from the Department of Public Safety, delivered via secure email, asking permission to temporarily integrate the river's exterior surveillance feed into an ongoing infrastructure resilience study. The language was veiled in policy jargon, citing real-time environmental mapping and response latency calibration, but Morgan understood the subtext. This wasn't about mapping. It was about observation. Karen's patterns, her movements, her routines, they were no longer being cataloged solely by his private system. She had attracted institutional attention. Jada was cautious, hesitant to involve broader systems without transparency, but Morgan reminded her that their own position had become untenable by conventional means. He authorized the request under conditional access, setting hard limits on retrieval frequency and storage permissions. The moment that bridge was crossed, the nature of their conflict changed. 2 nights later, Karen returned, not to vandalize, not to intrude, but to watch. She stood across the street, beneath the sodium glow of a streetlight, arms folded, staring at their porch like someone trying to decipher a foreign language. She didn't approach. She didn't film. She simply watched, unblinking, unmoving, until finally turning and disappearing into the shadows between houses. Jada called it theater. Morgan called it escalation by stagnation, the act of doing nothing so deliberately that it redefined the previous noise as preparation. That same week, the anonymous service card from the visual alignment team resurfaced, now posted on the community bulletin near the dog park. Identical branding, identical font. But this time it included a QR code that, when scanned, led to a survey asking residents to vote on preferred residential surveillance boundaries, using heat maps and hypothetical angles. It was dressed as data collection. It was, in truth, a referendum, manufactured consensus dressed in civility. Morgan submitted the URL and QR code to the liaison's office, and within hours, the site was blocked under a municipal fraud alert. That confirmation changed everything. Karen wasn't acting alone anymore. Someone had been enabling her, or at the very least adopting her techniques. The idea that this had moved beyond neighborly control into strategic pressure was deeply unsettling, but it also clarified the next step. Morgan didn't investigate further. He submitted everything, video, correspondence, intercepted flyers, to the city legal channel, attaching a formal request for protective review. Jada, watching him work, said nothing for a long time. Then she suggested they temporarily deactivate non-essential interior systems to eliminate the feeling of internal pressure. Morgan agreed. That night the house felt lighter, but quieter didn't mean safer. The next day, their internet connection began to falter. At first, it was subtle. Minor latency spikes, buffering delays, but within 24 hours, full outages began occurring, always between 2 and 3 a.m. Morgan ran diagnostics. The system was clean. The ISP confirmed no regional issues. The modem showed full function. Yet the cloud backups repeatedly failed during the same window. Finally, after installing a local packet sniffer, Morgan caught the anomaly. A ping flood hitting their router. Not strong enough to disable it entirely, but enough to disrupt secure transfers. This wasn't accidental. Someone was timing it to the nightly surveillance sync window. Someone was trying to sever the chain. Jada contacted a cybersecurity analyst through a referral from her former firm. The woman, a soft-spoken network engineer who had handled infrastructure threats for a mid-size financial firm, agreed to monitor their IP for a week. She called back within 2 days. "It's not professional," she said, "but it's deliberate. Someone is using a basic spoofing botnet to reroute your authentication. It's amateur, but with enough trial and error they could find an exploit. I'd recommend moving your system off-grid for a while." Morgan nodded and thanked her. That night, he shifted the security system to a closed-circuit fallback with cold storage redundancy. If they couldn't upload, they'd store locally. That decision proved critical less than 48 hours later. It happened on a Sunday evening, just before dusk. Karen was walking her usual loop. Sidewalk, corner, turned back up the opposite lane, but this time she paused beside their property and took a slow, panoramic sweep with what appeared to be a field tablet. She held it chest high, rotated slowly, capturing their frontage in full. Not illegal, but very, very specific. At that moment, one of their hidden ground units captured a brief flash. A second figure standing behind the hedges across the street, also holding a device. They didn't move. They simply mirrored her posture. When Karen completed her sweep, she gave the faintest nod and continued walking. The second figure slipped away. The video was reviewed 4 times. Each angle matched. Each timestamp synced. Morgan and Jada submitted the footage directly to the liaison office with a flag for external coordination. The reply was faster than usual. Maintaining passive observation. Recommend no contact. Action may be pending. It was the closest they had come to confirmation that this was no longer about them alone. It was about system integrity. It was about the way Karen had turned social structures into weapons and how someone else had started reinforcing her reach. That night, Jada finally admitted what they had both been resisting. "She's not just dangerous," she said. "She's organized. And someone else is learning from her." Morgan didn't argue. He activated the silent alarm system, turned off all exterior lights, and slept in the downstairs den with the monitor active. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. They weren't fighting a person anymore. They were confronting a method. Karen's silence wasn't absence. It was recalibration. Morgan and Jada had learned that by now. When she disappeared from view, it wasn't because she was finished. It was because she was preparing something larger. Her patterns became more diffused, harder to track. She no longer appeared at predictable hours, nor did she follow her usual walking routes. Instead, there were signs of her presence left behind. Objects slightly out of place, motion-activated sprinklers triggered at odd hours, and one morning, the distinct chemical odor of industrial cleaner near their back gate, where no one had sprayed. The plants nearby showed signs of damage the next day. What had been localized psychological manipulation now escalated into physical consequences. Still, there was no direct confrontation. No vandalism that could be tied with certainty. Just enough to force the Rivers into constant surveillance mode, and just ambiguous enough to keep her on the safe side of the law. Karen had mastered the art of implication. Then came the power anomalies. Not outages, interruptions. Lights flickering in one room, then stabilizing. Security alerts reporting momentary voltage drops, usually between 3 Shiu and 4 Caduce a.m. Jada checked the logs and noticed a consistent 38-second blackout from the front porch sensor. Morgan opened the main circuit panel and found the tamper seal partially unseated. It wasn't broken. It was tested. Someone had been there, checked how far they could push without tripping the main, and put it back just enough to blend in. They reported it, and the department flagged it. Not enough for charges, enough to document. The following evening, someone rang the doorbell at 3:11 a.m. and ran. It was childish on the surface, but the doorbell camera was also disabled for precisely 90 seconds. Whoever triggered it knew the exact system response window. Morgan had timed it himself during a routine reboot 2 weeks prior. This wasn't harassment. This was a technical probe. Jada insisted on reaching out to the city again. This time, the reply wasn't procedural. It was direct. The department had received 4 similar reports from homes in adjacent zones, all involving manipulated surveillance systems, obscured footage, and mild infrastructure interference. Karen was now linked to a behavioral pattern under active investigation. They weren't told the scope. They didn't need to be. The energy around the neighborhood had changed. People began closing their blinds earlier. Conversations at the local store cut off when Karen entered. There was no open revolt against her, just a quiet friction, the sound of trust wearing thin. It was during this time that the drone appeared. It was small, consumer-grade, but fitted with a gimbal camera and flown low, slow, and deliberate. It hovered at the tree-line height, circled their property, paused over their backyard, and then retreated over the rooftops. It was illegal, but only if it recorded or trespassed airspace with malicious intent, and proving either required footage from the drone itself, not just the river's recordings. Morgan captured every second, time-stamped and watermarked, then sent the file to the liaison's legal tech division. The reply was clear. Maintain local logging, avoid confrontation, escalation pending administrative approval. The implication was unsettling. Something was being built in the background methodically, patiently. Karen was now the visible face of something larger, whether by coordination or inspiration. The next phase came not with noise, but with strategy. Flyers began appearing again, this time slipped anonymously under doorsteps, wrapped in translucent sleeves like lost dog notices. The content was more aggressive. Modern surveillance is the new silent tyranny. One headline read, accompanied by stock images of families behind fences, watched by glowing red camera lenses. Another depicted a house surrounded by laser grids, warning residents to reclaim their right to breathe unrecorded air. Jada found one stuck to the windshield of her car parked outside the market. She didn't touch it. She photographed it, gloves on, and mailed it to the legal contact handling their documentation. Morgan, meanwhile, noticed a new face in the neighborhood. A man in his 50s, nondescript, seen walking alone late at night. He never stopped to talk, never looked at houses, just walked the outer perimeter of the development, always counterclockwise. After 3 nights, the river's street sensors picked up the same movement pattern at 2:47 a.m. A slow pass along the sidewalk, a brief pause at their trash bins, then continuation. Nothing technically illegal, but it was all accumulating. The weight of suspicion, the layered uncertainty, the deliberate provocations designed not to inflict damage, but to erode security, to rewrite what safety meant within their own walls. Morgan and Jada stopped talking about escalation. They lived it. Every day became a calculated response. They limited movement after sunset, installed a Faraday sleeve in their breaker box, migrated their home server off-site via encrypted relay. The house itself became a closed system, airtight, alert, unshakable. That was when Karen made her next move. She filed a petition. Not in court, but with the Residential Improvement Board, a civilian-run review panel with no real authority, but often used to shame or coerce changes in property conduct. Her complaint was simple. Excessive, visible surveillance creating a hostile environment. She presented printed stills from outdated camera angles, annotated diagrams of fields of vision, and even quoted selected phrases from community bylaws taken entirely out of context. The board, not empowered to enforce removal, still issued a formal recommendation that Morgan consider the optics of his home technology presence. It wasn't enforceable, but it made the rounds. Within a week, 3 residents canceled service appointments with Morgan's consulting firm, citing discomfort. Jada discovered online chatter in a local forum speculating about the river's intentions, some accusing them of monitoring neighbors, others suggesting they were feeding footage to the government. It was fabricated, absurd, but it spread like mildew. Morgan received 2 anonymous voicemails. One simply said, "You're not welcome here." The other, "We don't like being watched." It was beyond Karen now. She had weaponized perception, and it had taken root. Jada reached a breaking point when she came home to find a plastic figurine on the porch, a tiny camera, 3D printed, positioned facing their door. Someone had placed it neatly, precisely. Not threatening, mocking. That night, she sat down and recorded a video journal for legal purposes, documenting the full timeline from their return to present, stating dates, times, emotional effects, financial losses, and systemic failures to intervene. She ended the recording not with emotion, but with clarity. This isn't a neighbor. This is coordinated pressure masquerading as community concern. And it's working. Morgan didn't speak. He uploaded the file, backed it up 3 ways, and then sat outside until morning with a thermal sensor and a compact repeater scanning the property every 6 seconds. At 4:18 a.m., the system registered movement. Far perimeter, east hedge. No breach, just a figure pausing, watching, waiting. When they disappeared, Morgan didn't pursue. He checked the footage, confirmed storage integrity, and filed the clip directly with the liaison task force. A new reply came, subject registered, external match initiated, position under review. It was the first time the word subject had appeared. Not person, not neighbor, subject. Karen was no longer being tolerated. She was being profiled. And for the first time, something shifted in Morgan. Not relief, not satisfaction, but grim affirmation. They were no longer alone. And someone else, finally, was watching her. Karen made her final move in the same way she had made her first, with silence, calculation, and confidence. It began with nothing more than a shift in weather, a string of warm, dry nights after weeks of humidity and rain, as if the air itself had cleared the stage. Morgan noticed that his motion detectors weren't just triggering from random animals or wind movement. They were going silent altogether during hours they were usually active. One by one, the pattern detectors began logging zero-movement windows, periods of flat inactivity that stood out precisely because they deviated from every previous behavioral rhythm they'd come to expect. Something was wrong. Jada ran diagnostics and confirmed the obvious. The sensors hadn't malfunctioned. They had been intentionally muted. Morgan didn't react with panic. He narrowed his focus. Each sensor was physically intact, the signal consistent, the logs uncorrupted. But the activation response windows had been pushed 5 milliseconds out of sync, barely perceptible, but just enough to bypass real-time alerts. It was a sophisticated maneuver, not impossible with access to the same model schematics, but it required timing, understanding, and proximity. It also required test runs. Someone had been preparing for this for days. They didn't speak that evening. They watched. The full surveillance grid was up, but Morgan switched the central monitor to manual cycling, disabling automation. He wanted to see everything. No algorithms, no assumptions, just direct feed. At 2:31 a.m., Karen stepped into frame. She wasn't dressed in black or concealing her identity. She wore a sun hat, beige windbreaker, gloves, a canvas bag slung across her shoulder, and in her hand, a long object wrapped in dark cloth. She entered from the side yard, the one adjacent to the neighbor's fence, where visibility was lowest and coverage was limited. But tonight, every angle was redirected. Every focus had been narrowed. She paused at the edge of the lawn, removed the cloth, and revealed a compact industrial sprayer. Not a spray can, not household paint, but a pressure-loaded application device typically used for construction-grade sealants. She tested the nozzle once, then raised it to the recessed camera beneath the front eave. One smooth trigger, a wide arc of gray chemical foam spread over the lens, blinding it instantly. She moved to the next. The entire process was executed in silence and symmetry. Each camera approached, sprayed, and blinded in 15-second intervals. No rush, no hesitation. Karen wasn't hiding. She was cleansing, removing visibility 1 point at a time. Jada stared at the screen, frozen. Morgan didn't move. At 2:39 a.m., the last exterior camera was hit. Then Karen turned and walked directly toward the front porch. She didn't knock. She didn't attempt entry. She placed a small envelope on the welcome mat, adjusted it neatly so the edges aligned with the door frame, and stepped back. Then she looked directly at the house, at the deadened cameras, and smiled. What Karen didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that none of the disabled units were feeding to the main server. For the last 72 hours, Morgan had rerouted all critical feeds to the City Liaison's encrypted monitoring hub, using a silent failover protocol that bypassed standard IP routing. Every camera, every frame, every action, archived and streamed live, watching her, tracking her. Every step of her final approach had been observed by the very system she thought she'd erased. And at that moment, sitting inside the Municipal Security Center was not a technician, not a liaison assistant, but the chief of police. He had arrived earlier that evening, unannounced, following a personal request from the city administrator, who had received one too many flagged incidents linked to Karen's name. The chief had reviewed the archive himself. He had asked for real-time access, and now he was watching. At 2:42 a.m., the chief issued a quiet directive. 2 unmarked patrol vehicles that had been staged 3 blocks away moved into position. They cut their lights, coasted in, and came to a silent stop across the street. Morgan and Jada heard nothing. No sirens, no commotion. But they saw it. Karen, still standing in place, slowly turned toward the sound of soft footsteps behind her. A voice, calm and clear, spoke. "Ma'am, step away from the property. Keep your hands where we can see them." Karen didn't panic. She smiled again. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, loud enough for Morgan to hear through the walls. "I'm assisting with neighborhood aesthetics." The officers didn't reply. One approached, gloves on, and retrieved the sprayer from the ground. Another took the envelope. Karen allowed herself to be guided toward the curb without resistance, as if the entire encounter were some grand performance. But her face changed when one of the officers spoke quietly into his radio and then turned toward her with a small black tablet. The officer held it up. On the screen, live footage. Karen, on their property, spraying the cameras, entering the porch, placing the envelope. No deniability. No ambiguity. The live stream continued playing as the officer turned the screen toward the 2nd Patrol Unit. Karen's face drained. The performance cracked. Her voice dropped half an octave. "I wasn't aware these were live." The officer didn't respond. He simply said, "You're under arrest for property defacement, unlawful trespass, and malicious interference with electronic infrastructure." She was read her rights. There was no struggle, no shouts, only the click of the cuffs and the sound of her canvas bag being zipped open to reveal a second sprayer, multiple coded stickers labeled Obstructed Zone A, and a laminated map of the neighborhood with 7 houses marked in red. Morgan and Jada watched from behind their curtains. No sense of triumph, no satisfaction, only silence, the kind that comes after a long storm, when even the wind stops pretending to have purpose. The officers stayed 20 minutes. Statements were taken. Karen was escorted into the vehicle without a word. As the patrol cars pulled away, Morgan stepped outside and retrieved the envelope. Inside was a printed note. 3 lines. Privacy is earned, not assumed. Reconsider your position. He read it once, folded it, and set it in the same folder Jada had built since their return. The folder was now over an inch thick. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Jada whispered, "She really thought no one was watching." Morgan replied, "She thought we were the only ones." In the days following Karen's arrest, the neighborhood exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for months. Oh. There were no official statements, no media presence, no wide-eyed speculation, just a subtle recalibration in the way people moved. Porches that had once been guarded now showed signs of quiet life again. Curtains that had stayed drawn were opened just enough to let in morning light. The street felt softer, less watched, as though a layer of invisible static had finally lifted. For Morgan and Jada, the aftermath wasn't celebration. It was processing. The system remained operational, but scaled back. Morgan kept the exterior surveillance live but disengaged the motion-activated floodlights and muted the alert sounds. Jada removed the notification summaries from her phone, letting the system run in silence for the first time in weeks. The cameras were still watching, but they were no longer extensions of tension. They were infrastructure again, not defense mechanisms. Karen's case entered the judicial system quietly. Their contact at the city liaison office informed them that charges had been officially filed: trespassing, criminal mischief, unlawful surveillance interference, and property defacement. But what stood out most was the internal city note attached to her file. Subject linked to multiple incidents involving coordinated manipulation of public perception through neighborhood psychological pressure campaigns. That phrasing stayed with Jada, not just because of its precision, but because it confirmed what they had suspected all along. Karen wasn't just overbearing or obsessive. She had developed an entire framework around control, one she believed could be sustained through civility and technical ambiguity. The arrest didn't dismantle her legacy, but it froze it. It reminded the neighborhood that silence is not the same as safety, and that civility used as a weapon leaves deeper scars than open hostility. There was no apology from Karen. No letter, no final gesture. Her home remained dark. Mail collected by an unknown third party. Lawn slowly giving way to uneven patches and overgrowth. Some neighbors asked cautious questions in passing, but most avoided the topic entirely. Everyone knew, but no one wanted to say her name. One morning, Morgan walked the full perimeter of their property. Not checking sensors or testing equipment, just walking. The trellis had been repaired. The mailbox realigned. The lawn grew evenly again, untouched by chemicals or careless boots. He paused near the front gate, staring at the spot where Karen had stood that last night. The envelope she left still sat in the file drawer, but it had lost its power. It was just paper now. Inside the house, Jada was sorting their documentation into 2 folders, one marked Evidence, the other Lessons. When Morgan asked what the second was for, she answered without looking up. Patterns, pressure points, how people try to push boundaries without ever raising their voice. He didn't question it. She had always seen patterns better than he did. That afternoon, a formal letter arrived from the Department of Public Safety. thanking the Rivers for their cooperation during the incident review and informing them that their residence had been cleared from any ongoing monitoring integration. The city was withdrawing from the case, having completed its documentation and concluded its interest. The neighborhood, as far as the city was concerned, had returned to normal, but Morgan and Jada knew better. Normal wasn't a status, it was a perception. And once broken, perception doesn't return. It adapts. It learns. They took a weekend trip 2 weeks later, their first since returning home. No hesitation, no second-guessing. The cameras stayed on, silent, unobtrusive. The system now stored footage in 3 separate off-site locations. Not because they expected more trouble, because they understood now that control wasn't about anticipating attack. It was about being able to respond without panic. When they returned, everything was as they left it. That small fact meant more than either of them admitted. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Jada sat outside with her coffee, watching the street. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't scanning for threat. Just watching, loosely, as life moved on. Morgan joined her, handed her a folded envelope. She opened it and smiled. It was a printed note he'd written. 3 words. "We're still here." They sat without speaking. The wind light, the sun soft, the world, at least for now, quiet.